Hey guys, tonight we're not just dipping our toes into history, we're diving headfirst into the cold, murky depths of imperial collapse. Imagine, for a moment, that you're living in a world of unparalleled grandeur, where magnificent aqueducts crisscross the landscape, mighty legions march to the beat of triumph, and your very name echoes through the marbled halls of power. You're Rome, the eternal city, the undisputed mistress of the known world, basking in a glow that seems destined to last forever. But even the brightest stars eventually begin to dim, and tonight, you're going to feel the first, almost imperceptible shivers of the twilight of an empire. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're out there somewhere in the quiet hum of your own corner of the world, let us know where you're listening from. Perhaps you're nestled in a cozy apartment in New York City, or maybe drifting off in a peaceful cottage in rural England. Wherever you are, just relax. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the precipice of an era, not a sudden cliff edge, but a long, gentle slope downwards that stretches for centuries. It's subtle at first, almost imperceptible amidst the daily grind of empire. You're living in a Rome that still feels invincible, still believes in its manifest destiny. Yet if you pay close attention, if you quiet your mind and listen to the whispers carried on the Mediterranean breeze, you'll start to hear the creaking of old timbers. This isn't the dramatic crash you see in Hollywood movies. This is the slow, deliberate work of time and internal strain. A kind of structural fatigue setting in. You might be a wealthy senator, enjoying your morning olives and spiced wine, or perhaps a humble farmer tilling the sun-baked fields of Gaul. But either way, you're connected to this vast, sprawling entity, and its subtle shifts affect your very being. Think about it. For centuries, Rome had been an engine of expansion. You, as a Roman citizen, felt the boundless energy of conquest, the thrill of new territories, new resources, new slaves flowing back into the heart of the empire. But by the 2nd century CE, that engine begins to sputter. The easy victories are gone. The borders are vast, extending from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the misty forests of Britannia. You realize that simply holding on to what you have is becoming an immense, draining task. No longer is the empire growing outwards. Now it's constantly pushing back on its perimeter. A constant, low-level thrum of conflict. This transition from aggressive expansion to defensive maintenance is the first great sign that something is fundamentally changing. You're no longer dreaming of new provinces, you're just hoping to keep the ones you have secure. You see the shift in the legions themselves. Once, they were citizen soldiers, fighting for hearth and home, for the glory of Rome. Now, they're becoming a professional, largely mercenary force, recruited from the frontiers, often with dubious loyalties. You might chuckle at the idea of a soldier more loyal to his pay than to the emperor. But as the decades turn into centuries, this becomes a very real, very dangerous problem. Imagine your local legionary, a grizzled veteran from Thrace, who's never set foot in Rome, fighting not for abstract ideals, but for land, for loot, for his family back in the borderlands. This pragmatic, almost transactional relationship replaces the fervent patriotism that once fueled the republics and early empires' expansion. The very fabric of military loyalty starts to fray, subtly, almost invisibly, like threads in an ancient tapestry. Historians still debate whether this professionalization was a necessary adaptation or the beginning of the end for Roman military effectiveness. Some argue it made the army more efficient for defense. Others claim it detached the army from the civilian population, making it a law unto itself. You also start to notice a growing divide, not just geographically, but socially. The vast wealth generated by conquest flowed disproportionately to the elite, creating a glittering, opulent lifestyle for a select few. You, if you were one of the privileged, would enjoy lavish banquets, private bathhouses, and sprawling villas adorned with mosaics and frescoes. But for the vast majority, life remained a struggle. The free peasantry found it increasingly difficult to compete with large estates worked by slave labor, leading to widespread unemployment and a growing urban underclass, reliant on handouts from the state. You might hear whispers of discontent in the taverns, murmurs about the fairness of it all. This growing economic disparity isn't a new phenomenon in empires, of course, but the scale of it in Rome, coupled with slowing external growth, begins to place immense strain on the social cohesion. It's like a colossal building where the foundation is starting to crack, even as the upper floors are still being adorned with gold. A modern parallel might be the increasing wealth gap you observe in many societies today, leading to social unrest and political instability. And then there's the bureaucracy. As the empire expands, so too does the machinery of government. You find yourself navigating an increasingly complex web of edicts, taxes, and officialdom. What was once a relatively lean administration becomes bloated and inefficient. Imagine the piles of papyrus, the endless chains of command, the delays in decision-making. Corruption, always present to some degree, begins to fester. You might have to pay a bribe to get a permit, or find that a local official is turning a blind eye to illicit activities in exchange for personal gain. This isn't just about a few bad apples. It's about a system that has grown so large, so unwieldy, that it struggles to govern itself effectively, let alone the millions under its sway. A little-known detail is the sheer volume of paperwork involved in managing the empire, from military rosters to tax receipts, all painstakingly copied by hand. The logistical nightmares alone were staggering, often leading to slow responses to crises and missed opportunities. You feel the weight of this inefficiency, even if you can't quite articulate it, in the slow grinding of daily life, in the increasing demands of the state, the sheer size of the empire. Once its greatest strength, gradually becomes its greatest vulnerability. You are part of a vast, interconnected network of roads, ports, and trade routes, a marvel of ancient engineering. But this very connectivity also makes it difficult to manage. Communications are slow. News of a barbarian incursion on the Rhine might take weeks to reach Rome, and orders for troop deployment even longer to reach the frontier. You're constantly trying to put out fires in distant lands, stretching resources thin, making your central authority feel more distant and less immediate. It's like trying to steer a colossal ship with a rudder that responds only after a significant delay. The logistical challenges alone were immense, and the resources needed to simply maintain order across such a vast expanse were astronomical. You find yourself paying ever higher taxes, seeing more and more of your produce or coin funneled to the distant imperial coffers, all to maintain this sprawling behemoth. You start to notice a subtle shift in philosophy, too. The old Roman virtues, gravitas, pietas, virtus, the emphasis on duty, respect, and strength, begin to wane. There's a growing sense of fatalism, a feeling that perhaps the best days are behind you. You might hear learned men debating in the forums, questioning the very foundations of Roman society. While these intellectual discussions might seem far removed from your daily life, they reflect a deeper current of anxiety flowing through the empire's veins. This intellectual and spiritual drift is hard to quantify, but it's there. A quiet erosion of the collective will that once drove Rome to conquer the world. It's a bit like seeing a once optimistic society gradually losing its collective faith in progress, becoming more cynical, more resigned. As the 2nd century gives way to the 3rd, you also begin to witness the terrifying spectacle of imperial instability. The 5 Good Emperors era, a golden age of stability and prosperity, gives way to the crisis of the 3rd century. You see emperors rising and falling with dizzying speed, often at the hands of their own legions. Imagine the sheer chaos one emperor proclaimed today, assassinated tomorrow, replaced by another warlord who promises the soldiers more pay. This political merry-go-round isn't just an amusing spectacle. It throws the entire empire into disarray. Laws become inconsistent, borders are neglected, and civil wars erupt, tearing at the very fabric of the state. This internal strife saps Rome's strength, drains its treasury, and leaves its frontiers vulnerable. You feel the constant anxiety, the lack of certainty. Will your city be sacked by a rival general? Will your taxes be doubled overnight by a new, desperate ruler? It's a truly horrifying thought, realizing that the very people sworn to protect you are now the greatest threat to your stability. You're still there, caught in the currents of Roman history, feeling the subtle tremors beneath your feet. Remember that creeping unease from the last chapter? Well, now it's starting to manifest in ways that are far more tangible, perhaps even palatable, or unpalatable, as the case may be. You might be a wealthy Roman enjoying the luxury of running water in your villa, or perhaps a city dweller benefiting from the public baths, oblivious to a silent, insidious threat lurking within the very infrastructure of your advanced society. This is where we step into a truly horrifying, albeit somewhat controversial, aspect of Rome's decline, the theory of lead poisoning. You see, for all its engineering brilliance, Rome had a peculiar fondness for lead. You used it for everything: pipes that carried water through your magnificent aqueducts, linings for your wine vats, even as a sweetener for your food and drink. Yes, you heard that right. Your wine, which you might be sipping right now from a finely crafted goblet, was often boiled down in lead pots to create a sweet syrup called sapa or defrutum. The Romans loved it, adding it to wine to improve its taste, to food for sweetness, and even to cosmetics. You're probably thinking, surely they knew it was bad for them. And that, my friend, is where the horror truly sets in. They didn't. Or if they did, the immediate benefits outweighed the long-term, devastating consequences they couldn't fully comprehend. Imagine yourself, a Roman aristocrat, indulging in a lavish banquet. You drink cup after cup of deliciously sweetened wine, perhaps even served from lead-lined pitchers. Your food, cooked in lead-lined pots, might be seasoned with spices stored in lead containers. Even the cosmetics you might dab on your face could contain lead compounds. You're unknowingly consuming a slow-acting poison, day after day, year after year. The very water you rely on, flowing through those intricate lead pipes, picks up minute traces of the heavy metal. While the calcium carbonate in hard water might have formed a protective layer inside some pipes, in areas with softer water, the leaching would have been continuous. The effects of chronic lead poisoning, known as plumbism, are insidious. You might experience headaches, fatigue, memory loss, and a general dulling of the senses. Over time, it can lead to kidney failure, anemia, neurological damage, and reproductive issues. For the wealthy elite, who had the most access to lead-lined dinnerware, lead-sweetened wine, and elaborate plumbing systems, the exposure would have been significantly higher. You can almost picture them, these powerful senators and emperors, slowly losing their cognitive edge, becoming irritable, unpredictable, perhaps even exhibiting symptoms that today we would associate with mental instability or dementia. Some historians, though certainly not all, have even theorized that the eccentric or cruel behaviors of certain Roman emperors could have been exacerbated by chronic lead exposure. Imagine Nero or Caligula, perhaps not just megalomaniacs, but men slowly poisoned by the very comforts of their empire. This is a truly horrifying thought. Isn't it the very pinnacle of Roman society? Unwittingly undermining their own health and perhaps their decision-making capabilities. However, it's crucial to add a note of academic debate here. Historians still debate whether lead poisoning was a major cause of the Roman Empire's fall. While there's undeniable evidence of widespread lead use and detectable levels in Roman bones, Some argue that the actual dosage consumed might not have been high enough to cause widespread cognitive impairment across the entire population, or that other factors were far more significant. The lead theory, while fascinating and chilling, is often a topic of fervent academic discussion, with varying degrees of emphasis placed on its impact. Some scholars suggest that the poorer classes, who relied more on public wells and pottery for water, might have been less exposed than the wealthy, who had private lead pipes. Others counter that even low levels of chronic exposure can have significant public health consequences over generations. Beyond the lead, you find your daily life in Rome is becoming more complex, perhaps even more precarious. Remember those legions from the last chapter, whose loyalty was shifting? Well, now you're feeling the direct impact. As civil wars become more frequent and imperial succession more violent, you realize that your property, your very life, is at the mercy of ambitious generals and their armies. You see soldiers marching through your city, not as protectors, but as potential plunderers. The crisis of the 3rd century we briefly touched upon is now your lived reality. You watch as emperors are installed and assassinated with bewildering speed. There were over 20 emperors in a 50-year period, many meeting violent ends. It's like watching a deadly game of musical chairs, but the stakes are the stability of your entire world. You might be an artisan in Rome, relying on steady trade for your livelihood. But with constant internal strife, roads become unsafe, banditry increases, and trade routes are disrupted. You find it harder to get raw materials, harder to sell your finished goods. The once thriving marketplace might feel a little less vibrant, a little more uncertain. You might even hear rumors of inflation, a subtle erosion of the value of your coins. The emperor might issue new currency with less silver or gold content, hoping to pay his legions. But all it does is make your hard-earned money worth less and less. It's a cruel trick, making you feel richer on paper while your purchasing power dwindles. This economic instability is a quiet, persistent hum of anxiety in the background of your life. Then there's the increasing pressure from outside. You might live hundreds of miles from the Rhine or Danube, but you can feel the growing unease. The barbarians, as you call them, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, they aren't just isolated tribes anymore. They're forming larger, more cohesive groups, driven by various factors: population growth, climate change, or perhaps just a desire for the richer lands of the Roman Empire. You hear stories, terrifying whispers of raids, of Roman towns being sacked, of legions struggling to hold the line. Your once invincible empire now seems to be constantly on the defensive, stretching its resources and manpower to the breaking point. It's a never-ending game of whack-a-mole on the frontiers, and you're starting to wonder if Rome has enough hammers. Consider the sheer cost of maintaining such a vast military machine. You, as a taxpayer, bear the brunt of this burden. Taxes become heavier, more frequent. The state demands more of your grain, more of your livestock, more of your labor. The very act of living within the empire becomes an economic strain. You might grumble about the corrupt tax collectors, or the distant emperor who seems to care little for your struggles. This growing resentment, this feeling of being constantly squeezed, corrodes the loyalty of the populace. A little-known fact is that some Roman citizens would even voluntarily join barbarian tribes or hide out in remote areas to avoid paying increasingly burdensome imperial taxes. This kind of widespread tax evasion, or even outright defection, significantly weakened the state's ability to fund its defenses. You also feel the weight of a changing climate. While specific climatic shifts and their exact impact are still debated, some scholars suggest that periods of drought or unusual weather patterns may have impacted agricultural yields in certain regions, adding to the economic strain and potentially encouraging barbarian migrations. Imagine a year where your harvest is poor, but the tax collector still demands his due. The struggle to simply feed your family becomes a relentless, grinding burden. This intertwining of environmental factors with economic and political pressures creates a complex web of challenges that the empire, in its already weakened state, struggles to untangle. You are living in a time when the very heavens seem less benevolent, adding another layer of anxiety to your already troubled existence. You're still there, perhaps drifting deeper into that comfortable state between wakefulness and sleep. But the echoes of Rome's twilight continue to resonate. We've talked about the internal rot of lead and the relentless churn of emperors. Now, let's turn our gaze outwards, to the frontiers of the sprawling Roman Empire, where the true, terrifying reason for its eventual collapse began to pound on the gates with increasing urgency. You are about to witness the slow, inexorable tidal wave of what you, as a Roman, would simply call barbarians. You hear their names whispered with fear in the markets, muttered with contempt by legionaries, and debated with growing panic in the Senate. The Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, the Franks, the Alemanni. For centuries, Rome had managed these frontier tribes. You had either conquered them, absorbed them, or kept them at bay with a mixture of military might and diplomatic cunning. You had built impressive defensive lines, like Hadrian's Wall in Britannia, which you might recall from earlier bedtime tales, a tangible symbol of Roman dominance. But now, something is different. The pressure isn't just a sporadic raid, it's a systemic, relentless push. Imagine yourself as a farmer living near the Danube frontier. You wake up one morning, and the usual peace is shattered by the distant, chilling sound of horns and war cries. You see them, a mass of unfamiliar faces, perhaps riding hardy ponies, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. These aren't just small bands looking for plunder. These are entire peoples on the move, entire families, with their livestock, their possessions, seeking new lands, fleeing something even more terrifying than the Romans. What are they fleeing? Historians still debate the primary driver behind the massive barbarian migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries. Was it overpopulation in their original lands, climate change leading to agricultural failures, or the terrifying push from the Huns further east? Whatever the ultimate cause, you are now caught in the crossfire of this monumental demographic shift. The horror isn't just their presence, it's the sheer scale of their numbers. You, the Roman Empire, had always been able to raise enough legions to crush any localized rebellion or repel any single tribal incursion. But now, you are facing tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands, of people, desperate and determined. Your proud legions, once the undisputed masters of the battlefield, find themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and increasingly, outfought. You hear stories, terrifying and unbelievable, of Roman armies being annihilated, of once proud cities being sacked. A particularly chilling incident, one that sent shivers down the spine of every Roman, was the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. Imagine you are a high-ranking official in Constantinople, the new eastern capital. You receive news, slow and agonizingly piecemeal, that the Visigoths, a large Germanic tribe, whom Rome had reluctantly allowed to settle within its borders. Remember? Trying to manage immigration was always a Roman headache. Have rebelled. Emperor Valens himself marches out with a massive army to meet them. You wait anxiously for news of a glorious victory, a return to the old ways. But the news that eventually trickles back is horrific. The Roman army was utterly routed, perhaps 2/3 of it destroyed, and Emperor Valens himself was killed in battle. It's an unthinkable defeat, a catastrophic blow to Roman prestige and manpower, a clear signal that the invincible empire could bleed, and bleed badly. A little-known detail from Adrianople is that the Roman heavy cavalry, which should have been decisive, was drawn away early in the battle, leaving the infantry vulnerable to the Visigothic cavalry and infantry charge. This wasn't just a single battle. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. The Roman military, stretched thin across thousands of miles of frontier, constantly fighting civil wars for imperial succession. Remember that dizzying conveyor belt of emperors? Simply couldn't cope with the sustained pressure. you find that more and more resources are being diverted to the military, starving other essential services. Roads fall into disrepair, public works are neglected, and schools close. Your once vibrant public life begins to wither, as the empire focuses solely on survival. It's like a perpetually ill person, constantly battling new infections, unable to ever fully recover their strength. You see the impact of this constant warfare on the very land around you. Farms are abandoned, fields lie fallow, their inhabitants fleeing to the relative safety of walled cities. But even the cities aren't entirely safe. You hear tales of sieges, of starvation, of ransoms paid in gold and silk to appease the invaders. The Vandals, for example, would later sail their fleet from North Africa and sack Rome itself. The sheer audacity of it. A barbarian force, once confined to the land, now dominating the seas that Rome once ruled supreme. This loss of control over the Mediterranean, once Rome's internal highway, was a crippling blow to trade and communication. The continuous barbarian pressure also led to the gradual disintegration of Roman political and administrative control in the western provinces. You might wake up one day and find that the local Roman governor has fled, or that the military commander has declared himself independent. Your once clear chain of command unravels into a patchwork of local warlords and fragmented authorities. Taxes might still be collected, but now they go to a local strongman, not the distant emperor in Rome or Ravenna. This decentralization isn't a planned process. It's a messy, chaotic retreat, leaving ordinary citizens like yourself feeling abandoned and vulnerable. It's like the strings of a giant puppet being cut one by one until the whole structure collapses. Historians still debate the exact role of the barbarians in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Were they conquerors who actively brought about its downfall, or were they simply opportunistic migrants taking advantage of an already weakened and crumbling empire? Some argue that Rome's internal weaknesses, economic, political, social, made it a hollow empire, ripe for the picking. Others contend that the sheer weight of continuous invasions, coupled with the drain of civil wars, was simply too much for even Rome to bear. There's no single, universally accepted answer, and the reality is likely a complex interplay of both factors. But from your perspective, on the ground, you only feel the relentless, terrifying pressure from beyond the borders, the growing realization that the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is a fading memory. The once distant threat now sits firmly at your doorstep, demanding entry. You're still here, suspended in that twilight space where history drifts into dreams. The chill of the barbarians at the gates lingers. But now, let's pull back the camera, so to speak, and focus on the very heart of the empire's power structure, the throne itself. You're about to witness a spectacle of instability so profound, so utterly chaotic, that it alone could arguably bring a mighty empire to its knees. Welcome to the era of emperors on a conveyor belt. Remember that brief mention of the crisis of the 3rd century? It's not just a dusty academic term. It's your lived reality, stretching for decades. You wake up each morning, and the news from the capital or whichever city claims to be the capital that week is rarely reassuring. An emperor is proclaimed here, another assassinated there. It's a dizzying, terrifying carousel of power. And you, the ordinary Roman citizen, are merely a bewildered spectator. Imagine trying to run a country, let alone a vast empire, when the person at the top changes more frequently than the seasons. From 235 CE to 284 CE, a mere 49 years, you witness approximately 26 legitimate emperors, not to mention countless pretenders, usurpers, and would-be rulers who lasted only a few months or even weeks. It's an unprecedented period of political fragmentation. You might chuckle at the absurdity of it, a dark humor born of desperation. But the reality is chilling. Each new emperor, often a successful general, rises to power on the backs of his legions. Their loyalty is to him, not necessarily to the concept of Rome, and certainly not to his predecessor. This creates a vicious cycle. A general wins a battle. His troops declare him emperor. He marches on Rome or the current imperial residence, overthrows the existing emperor, and then himself becomes vulnerable to the next ambitious general. You hear the constant rumors, the whispers of legions in Gaul proclaiming their commander emperor, or the Eastern armies doing the same. It's a never-ending power struggle, and the primary beneficiaries are the soldiers themselves, who demand ever-increasing pay, bonuses, and concessions from each new ruler to secure their loyalty. A little-known detail from this era is the sheer number of imperial mints, with so many short-lived emperors and usurpers vying for legitimacy. Each would issue their own coinage, often hastily made and debased, leading to rampant inflation and economic chaos across the empire. You, holding a coin in your hand, wonder if it will be worth anything tomorrow. This constant churn of leadership has devastating consequences. First, there's the obvious drain on resources. Each civil war requires immense expenditure of manpower, money, and supplies. Legions that should be defending the frontiers are instead marching against each other, tearing at the internal fabric of the empire. You see the devastation of these internal conflicts firsthand: cities plundered, farms laid waste, trade disrupted. Your roads, once arteries of commerce, now serve primarily as military highways for warring factions. Historians still debate whether the crisis of the 3rd century was primarily a military crisis, an economic crisis, or a political crisis. The truth is, it was all three, inextricably linked, forming a feedback loop of decline. Military instability led to political instability, which led to economic ruin, which in turn fueled more military revolts. Beyond the financial drain, there's the utter paralysis of governance. With emperors lasting only a year or two on average, there's no time for long-term planning, no consistency in policy. You might see a new tax implemented one year, only to be abolished by the next emperor, or a reform initiated only to be abandoned. The bureaucracy, already sprawling and inefficient, becomes even more confused and demoralized. Who do you follow? Whose orders are legitimate? It's a state of constant uncertainty, where strategic decisions for the empire's future are almost impossible to make. You feel this instability in your bones, in the lack of security, in the constant fear of arbitrary changes from above. Moreover, the best and brightest minds, the most capable generals and administrators, are often caught in these power struggles. If you are a talented young officer, you face a brutal choice: stay loyal to an emperor who might be overthrown tomorrow, or throw your lot in with a promising usurper, risking everything. The empire loses its most capable people to purges, assassinations, and the sheer exhaustion of perpetual conflict. It's a brain drain on an imperial scale, leaving the reins of power in the hands of those who are either ruthless, lucky, or simply desperate. Imagine the psychological toll this takes on you. The Roman citizen, the emperor, once a symbol of stability, divine favor, and the enduring power of Rome, is now a transient figure, often a crude soldier, who might not even visit the capital before being unceremoniously deposed. Your faith in the central authority erodes. You start to look to local strongmen, to regional warlords, for protection and stability, because the distant emperor seems increasingly irrelevant or impotent. This further fragments the empire, laying the groundwork for the independent kingdoms that will eventually emerge in the West. This period of barracks emperors, where power was effectively decided by military might rather than legitimate succession or senatorial approval, represents a profound shift in Roman society. The military, once the servant of the state, had become its master. They were the kingmakers, and their loyalty was bought, not earned through tradition or patriotism. You're living in a world where the sword holds more sway than the toga, where brute force trumps wisdom and law. It's a chilling thought, the very instrument of Rome's expansion now consumed by its own internal machinations. A humorous, if dark. Aside from this period, you might hear a joke circulating in the taverns about the job security of an imperial tailor. Imagine trying to keep up with the fashion needs of 26 different emperors in less than 50 years. One day it's a toga with purple trim. The next it's a general's uniform. Then maybe a more austere look. It's a ridiculous thought, but it subtly highlights the absurdity and instability of the time. You're still there, suspended in the quiet hum of the night, feeling the phantom weight of Roman history settling upon you. We've navigated the treacherous waters of imperial instability and felt the crushing pressure of barbarian migrations. Now, let's talk about a different kind of invader, one you couldn't see, couldn't fight with a sword, but whose chilling breath swept through your mighty empire with devastating effect, the plague's cold embrace. Imagine you're living in a bustling Roman city, perhaps Alexandria, the vibrant heart of Egypt, or even Rome itself. You wake up one morning feeling a strange weariness, a tightness in your chest. Soon, others around you begin to cough. Then, the fever sets in, followed by excruciating abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. This isn't just a common cold or a seasonal illness. This is something far more sinister, far more widespread, and utterly terrifying. You are experiencing the horrors of a pandemic, a force of nature that cared nothing for your legions, your emperors, or your magnificent aqueducts. The most infamous of these ancient scourges was the plague of Justinian, which struck the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, primarily, but also affected the West. In the 6th century CE, however, earlier, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, your empire was already grappling with devastating epidemics like the Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE, and the Plague of Cyprian, 250-262 CE. You can think of these as terrifying dress rehearsals for the later, more famous outbreaks. You, as a Roman citizen, would have witnessed firsthand the horrific toll these diseases took. The streets, once teeming with life, would become eerily quiet. Funeral pyres would burn incessantly, their smoke a constant, grim reminder of death's relentless march. The Antonine Plague, for instance, which some historians believe was an outbreak of smallpox or measles, swept through the Roman Empire like wildfire. Imagine being a soldier on the frontier, perhaps having just returned from a campaign in the East, bringing with you not just spoils of war, but also an invisible killer. The disease would have spread rapidly along the very trade routes and military roads that were once symbols of Roman strength and connectivity. You hear whispers of entire legions being decimated, of cities losing a quarter, a third, or even half of their population. This isn't just a few isolated deaths. This is a demographic catastrophe. Historians still debate the exact mortality rates of these ancient plagues and their precise impact on the Roman population. While figures are hard to ascertain, there's little doubt they caused widespread depopulation and immense suffering. The chilling thing is, you have no real understanding of germ theory. You attribute the plague to divine wrath, to bad air miasma, or to sorcery. You desperately try remedies that are utterly ineffective, relying on prayers, sacrifices, and primitive medicine. Imagine the desperation, the fear that permeates every household. You watch helplessly as your neighbors, your family members, succumb one by one. The social fabric begins to unravel. People flee cities, abandoning their homes and businesses, further disrupting economic life. Agriculture suffers as farmers die or abandon their fields. The impact on your military is particularly horrifying. Remember those stretched legions on the frontiers? Now imagine them being ravaged by disease. Entire units are wiped out, not by barbarian swords, but by an unseen enemy. This significantly weakens Rome's ability to defend its vast borders, making it even more vulnerable to those migrating tribes we talked about earlier. A legion that lost 30% of its strength to plague would be utterly ineffective against a determined barbarian force. This compounding factor, internal disease weakening defenses against external threats, creates a terrifying domino effect. A little-known detail from the Plague of Cyprian is that it contributed significantly to the crisis of the 3rd century, thinning out the population and weakening the army at the very time the empire was most politically unstable. The economic consequences are equally dire. You see fields left unplowed, workshops standing idle, and trade grinding to a halt. With so many people dying, there are fewer workers, leading to labor shortages. Wages might rise for those who survive, but overall productivity plummets. Cities, once economic powerhouses, become ghost towns. The empire's tax base shrinks dramatically, further crippling its ability to pay its legions, maintain its infrastructure, or provide basic services. You might be struggling just to find enough food. As supply chains collapse, it's a complete breakdown of the complex system that supported the empire, all because of a microscopic enemy. Beyond the immediate death toll, these plagues have profound psychological and social effects. You witness a deep sense of despair, fatalism, and disillusionment. Why bother building or striving when a silent killer can take everything away in an instant? This period of widespread death and suffering also contributed to the rise of new religious movements, particularly Christianity. In a world where traditional gods seemed powerless against disease, the promise of salvation and an afterlife offered by Christianity resonated deeply with a terrified populace. You might see more people turning to this new faith, seeking solace and meaning in the face of such overwhelming loss. The plagues, then, weren't just isolated events. They were recurring, devastating blows to the demographic, economic, and military strength of the Roman Empire. They depopulated vast regions, crippled the economy, weakened the army, and sowed seeds of doubt and despair among the populace. You, as a survivor, would carry the trauma of these events for the rest of your life. A constant reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest empire when confronted by the invisible forces of nature. It's a sobering thought, isn't it, that for all its power and glory, Rome could be brought to its knees not just by barbarians or bad emperors, but by a microorganism. You're still with us, drifting in that gentle current of historical narrative, the echoes of the plague's chilling cough still lingering in the quiet. We've covered the internal political chaos and the external barbarian pressures, along with the invisible enemy of disease. Now, let's explore a quieter, more insidious killer that gnawed at the very sinews of your empire economic chains. Not gold. You clutch your worthless coins, wondering where the trade went. Imagine yourself as a busy merchant in Ostia, Rome's port city, for centuries. Your life was defined by the arrival of ships laden with grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, and exotic spices from the distant East. The Roman economy was a marvel of the ancient world, driven by trade, agriculture, and the constant flow of wealth generated by conquest. But now, you notice a troubling slowdown. The harbor is not as bustling. The warehouses are not as full. You feel a tightening in your chest, a knot of worry that wasn't there before. The most visible symptom of this economic malaise is inflation, a silent thief that steals the value of your money. Remember that conveyor belt of emperors we talked about? Each new, desperate ruler, needing to pay his legions and secure his power, would often resort to debasing the currency. They'd simply mix less precious metal, gold or silver into the coins, replacing it with cheaper base metals like copper or lead. You'd receive the same looking coin, but it would be worth less. It's like being paid with a chocolate bar that gets smaller and smaller each week, even though the wrapper is the same size. Historians still debate the precise mechanisms and exact timeline of Roman currency debasement, but its impact on economic stability is undeniable. Some argue it was a necessary evil to fund wars. Others see it as a catastrophic misstep that eroded trust in the imperial government. You see the immediate effect in the marketplace. Prices for basic goods, bread, olive oil, wool begin to skyrocket. You might bring a handful of coins to the market that yesterday bought a week's food, and today they barely cover a single meal. This hyperinflation makes long-term planning impossible. Why save money when its value is constantly eroding? Why invest in a business when the costs of raw materials might double overnight? The incentive to produce and trade diminishes, leading to widespread economic stagnation. You might switch to bartering, exchanging goods directly, because you simply don't trust the imperial currency anymore. Compounding this, the very arteries of trade, the vast network of Roman roads and sea lanes, are becoming increasingly dangerous. With barbarian incursions on the frontiers and civil wars tearing through the interior, bandits and renegade soldiers make travel perilous. You might hesitate to send your goods across long distances, fearing they will be seized or destroyed. The cost of security rises, making trade less profitable. Imagine being a merchant trying to bring wine from Italy to Gaul. You now have to factor in the risk of being ambushed on the roads, or having your ship raided by pirates in the Mediterranean. This fear stifles commerce, pushing economic activity inwards, towards localized, self-sufficient communities rather than a vibrant imperial economy. Then there's the changing nature of labor. The Roman Empire relied heavily on slavery, fueled by centuries of conquest. But as expansion halted and even reversed, the supply of new slaves dwindled. This, combined with the devastating effects of plagues that wiped out large portions of the population, remember the chilling cough, led to severe labor shortages. You might be a wealthy landowner, finding it increasingly difficult to find enough workers to till your fields, or a craftsman struggling to find apprentices. This shortage drives up the cost of labor, further squeezing profits and impacting agricultural output. A particularly insidious economic trend was the increasing autarky, or self-sufficiency, of large estates, latifundia. Faced with unreliable central authority, dangerous trade routes, and debased currency, wealthy landowners began to produce everything they needed on their own vast estates: food, clothing, tools. They became miniature, self-contained economies. You, as a peasant, might find yourself increasingly tied to such an estate, becoming a colonus, a tenant farmer who could not leave the land, essentially a serf. This system, while providing local stability, fundamentally undermined the imperial economy. It meant less trade between regions, less tax revenue for the central government, and a weaker urban economy. It's like thousands of tiny nations forming within the empire, each looking out for itself rather than contributing to a cohesive whole. This shift meant that the urban centers, once the engines of Roman civilization, began to decline. You might see artisans closing their shops, public buildings falling into disrepair, and the grand spectacles of the amphitheater becoming less frequent. Life in the city, once a draw, now offered fewer opportunities and more dangers. The vibrant hub of commerce and culture slowly faded. A little-known detail is that Roman tax laws became so burdensome and complex that many citizens simply tried to avoid being counted in the census, sometimes even fleeing their homes or abandoning productive land, further shrinking the empire's already dwindling tax base. This widespread tax avoidance was a massive blow to the state's finances. The empire, desperate for revenue to pay its soldiers and maintain its borders, resorted to ever more oppressive taxation. You, the ordinary citizen, would feel this burden acutely. Taxes were not just on land or produce, but on inheritances, sales, and even daily transactions. The system became less about fostering prosperity and more about extracting wealth to prop up a failing military. This oppressive taxation, combined with inflation and economic stagnation, created a downward spiral. People had less incentive to work hard or produce surplus, knowing that much of it would be taken by the state. So, while not as dramatic as a barbarian invasion or a coup d'état, the erosion of the Roman economy was a profound, slow-motion disaster. It starved the central government of the resources it needed, fragmented the vast imperial market, and ultimately undermined the prosperity and stability that had been the hallmark of Rome's greatest periods. You feel the weight of these economic chains, tightening slowly but inexorably around the empire's neck. Not made of gold, but of dwindling trust, broken trade, and worthless coin. It's a truly horrifying thought, isn't it? That the very foundations of your wealth could simply evaporate, leaving you adrift in an empire that can no longer afford to be an empire. You're still drifting, carried along by the gentle narrative current through the ever-thickening shadows of Rome's decline. We've felt the sting of inflation and the creeping paralysis of a failing economy. Now, let's turn our attention to the very backbone of the empire, the institution that built its glory and guarded its frontiers, but which also, tragically, began to turn its formidable power inward, the army's shifting loyalties. You watch as your protectors turn their gaze inward. Imagine yourself a Roman citizen living near a legionary camp for generations. The sight of the eagles, the disciplined march of the cohorts, filled you with a sense of security, of invincible strength. The Roman army was the most formidable fighting force the world had ever seen, a highly trained, well-equipped machine that had carved out an empire from scratch. But something has changed. The uniform is the same, the discipline still outwardly present, but the spirit, the fundamental loyalty, has begun to fracture. We touched upon this briefly. Remember, that dizzying carousel of emperors. Well, the legions were not just observers. They were the primary actors in that bloody drama. They were the kingmakers. When an emperor displeased them, or when a popular general promised greater rewards, the legions didn't hesitate to rebel, to march on the capital, and to install their own man on the throne. You see this happen again and again, a terrifying pattern repeating itself. Each successful usurpation sets a precedent, teaching other legions that power flows from the sword, not from Rome, not from the Senate, and certainly not from any grand, abstract idea of the empire. This constant involvement in internal power struggles had devastating effects on the army's primary mission, defending the empire. Legions were routinely pulled from the frontiers, leaving vast stretches of the border vulnerable to those barbarian migrations we discussed earlier. Imagine being a commanding officer on the Rhine, constantly having to look over your shoulder, wondering if you should be preparing to fight a Gothic raiding party or a rival Roman army marching from Italy. Your focus shifts from external threats to internal politics, a fatal distraction for any military force. Historians still debate whether the Roman army's decline was due to a decrease in fighting ability or simply an overwhelming number of internal and external threats. While individual units often fought bravely, the strategic coherence of the military suffered immensely. The composition of the army itself began to change dramatically. Remember how it transitioned from citizen soldiers to a professional force? That evolution continued as the pool of Roman citizens willing or able to serve diminished, and as the empire needed more and more manpower. It increasingly relied on recruiting barbarians, Germanic tribesmen, Goths, Franks, who were granted citizenship or allowed to serve in exchange for land or pay. You might see a unit composed almost entirely of men who speak Latin with a heavy accent, who worship different gods, and whose primary loyalty is to their own chieftain, or to the general who enlisted them. This isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself. These barbarian soldiers were often fierce and effective fighters. But it altered the fundamental character of the Roman army. Their loyalty was often personal, to their commander, rather than institutional, to the Roman state. If that commander decided to rebel, his largely non-Roman troops would likely follow him. A little-known detail is that by the late Roman Empire, many high-ranking generals were themselves of Germanic descent, like Stilicho or Ricimer. These men wielded immense power, often making and breaking emperors, embodying the shifting loyalties within the military command itself. You witness these powerful figures, almost kings in their own right, pulling the strings from behind the imperial facade. Furthermore, the quality of training and equipment began to decline in some areas. With constant warfare and economic strain, resources were stretched thin, You might see soldiers equipped with less effective armor or trained less rigorously than their predecessors. The legendary Roman discipline, while still present in some elite units, began to fray in others. This unevenness in quality meant that while some legions remained formidable, others were less capable of standing against determined invaders. The glorious image of the Roman legionary, once the epitome of military perfection, became tarnished by necessity and neglect. The army's ever-increasing demands for pay and resources also put immense strain on the already struggling imperial economy. Remember those economic chains? A significant portion of the empire's revenue, already depleted by inflation and a shrinking tax base, was funneled directly to the military. This created a vicious cycle. The empire needed the army to defend itself, but paying the army bled the empire dry, making it weaker and thus more reliant on the army. You feel this burden directly through increased taxes and requisitions. The military wasn't just a defensive force. It became a pervasive presence in civilian life. You might see soldiers acting as tax collectors or involved in local administration, blurring the lines between military and civilian authority. While this provided some local order, it also meant that military force was often the direct face of imperial power, rather than the more nuanced system of law and governance. You're living in an increasingly militarized society, where the will of the legions often takes precedence over established legal processes. So, the army, Rome's greatest strength, paradoxically became a major contributor to its weakness. Its internal power struggles fractured the state. Its changing composition shifted loyalties, and its insatiable demands drained the imperial coffers. You realize that your protectors, the very men who guaranteed the Pax Romana, had become a force of instability. Their gaze turned inward, their loyalty fragmented. It's a truly horrifying irony. The hand that built the empire was also the hand that, inadvertently, helped to tear it apart from within. You can almost feel the tremor of those legions marching, not against a foreign foe, but against Rome itself. You're still here, suspended in the quiet, reflective space of this historical journey, the echoes of the legion's shifting loyalties slowly fading into the background. We've traversed economic woes, political turmoil, and the relentless pressure from beyond the borders. Now, let's delve into a less tangible, yet equally profound force that played a crucial role in the empire's ultimate fate: religion's great divide. You witnessed the empire split, not just by borders, but by faith. For centuries, Rome's religious landscape was a diverse tapestry of polytheistic beliefs. You, as a Roman, might have worshipped Jupiter and Mars, honored your household gods, Lares and Penates, and even adopted deities from conquered lands. The empire was generally tolerant of different cults, as long as they didn't threaten Roman authority or state religion. It was a pragmatic approach: add more gods, add more blessings. But then, a new belief system began to rise from the east. Quiet at first, then growing with an unstoppable fervor: Christianity. Imagine you're living in Rome during the 1st or 2nd century CE. You might hear whispers about this new sect whose followers worshipped a single, crucified God, refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor, and met in secret. Initially, you might dismiss them as eccentric, perhaps even dangerous. The Roman authorities often viewed Christians with suspicion, seeing their monotheism and refusal to participate in state cults as an act of defiance, leading to periodic persecutions. You might witness a Christian being martyred in the amphitheater, their unwavering faith in the face of death both perplexing and strangely compelling. But despite the persecutions, Christianity continued to spread, especially among the poor, the marginalized, and eventually, even the elite. Why? Perhaps it was the promise of salvation, the emphasis on charity and community, or the idea of a universal brotherhood that resonated in an increasingly uncertain and brutal world. Remember those devastating plagues we talked about? In times of immense suffering, when traditional gods seemed powerless, Christianity offered hope and a sense of purpose. You might find solace in its message, seeing it as an answer to the widespread despair. The true turning point, however, comes in the 4th century. Imagine the shock, the bewilderment, when Emperor Constantine, after his victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, attributes his success to the Christian God and subsequently issues the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, granting religious toleration throughout the empire. Suddenly, Christianity goes from being a persecuted sect to a favored religion. Then, later in the same century, Emperor Theodosius I makes Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This shift, while seemingly a unifying force, inadvertently created a new set of divisions within the empire. You, if you were a devout pagan, would feel your traditional gods and practices being marginalized, even suppressed. Temples might be closed, ancient festivals curtailed. It's a profound cultural and religious upheaval, forcing a choice of allegiance that wasn't previously necessary. Historians still debate the extent to which the rise of Christianity contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Some argue that it diverted loyalty from the state to the church, fostering pacifism and undermining traditional Roman civic virtues. Others contend that it actually provided a new unifying force and a framework for survival after the empire's collapse. The internal divisions within Christianity itself also played a role. As it grew, different interpretations of doctrine emerged, leading to fierce theological debates and schisms. You might find yourself caught in heated arguments about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, or the role of bishops. These were not mere academic discussions. They were passionate, often violent disputes that tore communities apart and even led to imperial intervention. Emperors would often try to enforce a single orthodox view, leading to further purges and exiles. This religious infighting, while not directly causing barbarian invasions, certainly diverted imperial resources and attention, exacerbating existing political and social fragmentation. A little-known detail is how extensively some emperors, like Justinian in the Eastern Roman Empire, became involved in theological disputes, spending vast amounts of time and energy trying to reconcile warring Christian factions. Moreover, the rise of the Church as a powerful institution created a parallel power structure to the state. Bishops and patriarchs gained immense influence, sometimes even challenging imperial authority, especially in the Western Empire where imperial power was weakening. You might see a local bishop acting as the de facto leader of a city during a barbarian siege, providing solace and organization where the Roman government had failed. This growing power of the Church, while often beneficial for local populations, symbolized a shift in the locus of authority. Loyalty was increasingly given to the spiritual leader rather than the secular ruler. The focus on the afterlife and spiritual salvation, while comforting, could also be seen by some as diverting energy and ambition away from the earthly affairs of maintaining the empire. Why fight to the death for a decaying secular state when your true reward awaited in heaven? This isn't to say that all Christians were pacifists or disloyal. Far from it. Many served in the legions with distinction, but the fundamental worldview shifted for a significant portion of the population. So, the rise of Christianity, from a persecuted minority to the dominant faith, represents a monumental transformation within the Roman Empire. While it brought new unity to some, it also created deep divisions, shifted allegiances, and presented a powerful new institution that sometimes rivaled the state itself. You witness this great divide, not just on maps showing east and west, but in the very hearts and minds of the people around you. A silent but profound shift that reshaped the very soul of the empire. It's a truly horrifying thought, isn't it? That a force intended to bring solace could, in its complex integration, also contribute to the unraveling of a civilization. You're still there? Suspended in the quiet hum of the narrative, perhaps feeling the deep currents of faith and division that flowed through the Roman Empire. We've covered the internal rot, the external pressures, the economic decay, and the shifting loyalties that gnawed at Rome's foundations. Now, we arrive at a moment that, for you, as a Roman, would be the ultimate nightmare, the unthinkable, the cataclysmic event that signaled the end of an era, the sack of the eternal city. You huddle in fear as the gates finally give way. For centuries, Rome, the urbs aeterna, the eternal city, had been seen as invincible, impregnable, a sacred bastion of civilization. It had weathered civil wars, barbarian threats, and even plagues. The last time a foreign enemy had successfully sacked Rome was nearly 800 years prior, by the Gauls. The very idea of an enemy army breaching its walls, desecrating its temples, and plundering its treasures was anathema, a notion so terrifying it barely crossed the minds of most Romans. But now, in the year 410 CE, that unthinkable nightmare is becoming a terrifying reality. Imagine yourself a citizen of Rome, perhaps an elderly woman clutching your few possessions, or a young man trying to protect your family. The news has been grim for days, weeks even. The Visigoths, led by their formidable king Alaric, are at the gates. They have besieged the city before, starving its inhabitants into submission, extracting immense ransoms of gold and silver, silk and pepper. You remember the gnawing hunger, the desperate pleas for food, the despair that settled over the city like a shroud. You thought the worst was over. But this time, it's different. The city is still reeling from the previous sieges. Its defenses weakened, its granaries depleted. The imperial government, now largely based in Ravenna, remember that economic fragmentation. They even moved the capital for perceived safety. Seems distant, ineffective, and unwilling or unable to send meaningful aid. You hear rumors, terrifying whispers, that the city's defenses are compromised, perhaps by traitors within, or simply by the overwhelming desperation of a starving populace. Historians still debate the precise circumstances of the gates opening during the sack of 410 CE. Was it an act of betrayal by a slave, a desperate measure by starving citizens hoping for mercy, or a planned breach by Alaric's forces? Whatever the truth, the outcome is the same. On August 24th, 410 CE, the impossible happens. The Salarian Gate, a grand entrance to the Eternal City, is opened, whether by stealth, by force, or by treachery. The Visigoths pour in. You hear the shouts, the screams, the terrifying clang of steel on stone. The city, once the proud mistress of the world, is now a scene of utter chaos and terror. You huddle in fear in your home, listening to the horrifying sounds outside, the shattering of pottery, the splintering of wood, the terrified cries of your fellow citizens. The Visigoths were not a horde of mindless savages. They were Arian Christians, and Alaric himself issued orders to respect the churches and to spare those who sought refuge within them. You might witness scenes of devout Romans rushing to the safety of St. Peter's Basilica or other churches, hoping for divine protection. This detail, often overlooked, highlights the complex nature of the barbarian invaders, who were often more organized and less destructive than popular imagination suggests. However, this did not prevent widespread looting and destruction. You see your beautiful city, once a symbol of order and law, now subjected to the law of the sword. Villas are plundered, their priceless treasures seized, statues are toppled, public buildings defiled. While not a wholesale burning of the city, the psychological impact is profound. The sheer violation of Rome, the ultimate symbol of Roman power, sends shockwaves throughout the entire empire. It shatters the myth of Roman invincibility, not just for the barbarians, but for you, the Roman citizen, and for the world. A little-known detail is that many Romans, particularly the wealthy, had already fled the city over the previous decades as the situation worsened. But many remained too poor or too stubborn to leave, or too... This event, though not the sole cause of the Western Roman Empire's fall, remember, it was a long, complex decline, served as a powerful psychological blow. It was a tangible manifestation of all the preceding problems: the weakened army, the ineffective government, the economic collapse, the internal divisions. If Rome itself could fall, what hope was there for the provinces? You feel a profound sense of disillusionment, of betrayal by the very empire that was supposed to protect you. The very word barbarian might now evoke a deeper, more personal terror, a grim understanding that your world is irrevocably changed. The sack of 410 CE lasted only 3 days, but its echoes reverberated for centuries. It sent refugees fleeing to North Africa, to the Eastern Empire, carrying tales of horror and loss. It forced thinkers and leaders to reevaluate the very nature of Rome and its divine favor. Saint Augustine, a contemporary, would later write City of God in response to the sack, seeking to explain how a Christianized Rome could suffer such a fate, effectively shifting focus from the earthly city to the heavenly one. You witness the beginning of this profound intellectual and spiritual reorientation. So, as the sounds of plunder slowly recede, and a chilling quiet settles over the violated city, you realize that something fundamental has broken. The eternal city has fallen, not to a singular, overwhelming enemy, but to the culmination of centuries of internal decay and external pressure. It's a truly horrifying thought, isn't it? To witness the symbolic heart of your world utterly violated. To know that the invincible, the eternal, was not eternal after all? The psychological blow alone was enough to make even the most stalwart Roman question the very future of their civilization. You're still here, suspended in the quiet contemplation of history. The lingering echoes of Rome's sack in 410 CE now a fading memory, replaced by the chilling silence of its aftermath. We've traversed the internal decay, the external pressures, the economic collapse, the shifting loyalties, and the profound religious divisions that gnawed at the empire's foundations. We've witnessed the unthinkable, the violation of the eternal city itself. Now, as the final curtain falls on the Western Roman Empire, you are left to wander through the ruins, contemplating what remains. The sack of 410 CE was a profound psychological shock, but it wasn't the final blow that ended the Western Roman Empire. That came quietly, almost anticlimactically. 66 years later. You are living through decades of continued fragmentation. The emperors in the West become increasingly powerless, mere puppets manipulated by powerful barbarian generals, often of Germanic origin, who effectively control the legions and the remnants of the imperial administration. You see the emperors come and go, often installed and deposed by these powerful figures, almost as an afterthought. The real power now lies with men like Ricimer, or Orestes, who, ironically, are themselves products of the very borderlands Rome struggled to contain. Imagine yourself a resident of Italy in the mid-5th century. Your world is no longer truly Roman in the old sense. Roman law still exists in pockets. Latin is still spoken. But the central authority, the grand unifying force that once held everything together, has evaporated. You're likely living under the rule of a local strongman, a Roman general who has carved out his own territory, or perhaps directly under a barbarian king who has settled his people on Roman land. The empire has become a patchwork quilt of fragmented territories, each operating largely independently, responding to its own immediate needs and threats. The concept of Rome as a singular unified political entity is now little more than a historical memory, a distant echo from a glorious past. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 CE. You wake up on that day, or perhaps hear the news weeks later, that the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, has been deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. Odoacer doesn't bother to appoint a new puppet emperor. Instead, he simply sends the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, back to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. He then declares himself King of Italy, effectively ruling the former heartland of the empire without the pretense of a Roman emperor. You might not even feel a massive shift on that particular day. For many ordinary people, life had already changed so drastically over the preceding decades that the official fall was simply a confirmation of a reality they had been living for a long time. The taxes might still be collected, the land still tilled, but the illusion of a unified Roman state governing the West is finally gone. Historians still debate whether 476 CE was a fall or merely a transformation. Many scholars argue that the empire didn't fall as much as it evolved or transformed into various successor kingdoms, preserving many elements of Roman culture, law, and administration. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process of decentralization and adaptation. A little-known detail is that the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years, preserving much of Roman law, culture, and imperial traditions, effectively being the continuation of the Roman Empire. Just centered in the East, you watch as new kingdoms emerge: the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Frankish kingdom in Gaul. These are not just barbarian hordes, they are establishing new states, often adopting Roman administrative practices, even employing former Roman officials. Latin continues to be spoken. Roman roads are still used, though less maintained, and the Christian Church. Remember that Great Divide now becomes a crucial unifying force, providing structure and continuity in a fractured world. You find solace and guidance in the local bishop, who often becomes the true leader of the community, filling the void left by the absent imperial government. The horror of the fall isn't necessarily a single dramatic event, but the slow, grinding erosion of a way of life. It's the knowledge that the world you knew, the world your ancestors knew, is irrevocably gone. You wander through cities where once grand public buildings lie in ruins, their marble plundered for new constructions. The aqueducts might be broken, the bathhouses empty. Education declines, trade shrinks, and life becomes more local, more focused on survival. It's a regression, a shift from a highly organized, interconnected empire to a patchwork of smaller, often isolated, agrarian societies. You realize that the horrifying reason was never just one thing. It was a complex, interlocking web of challenges: lead poisoning, political instability, economic debasement, relentless barbarian pressure, devastating plagues, and a profound shift in religious and social loyalties. Each factor played its part, weakening the empire from within and without, until the sheer weight of accumulated problems became too much to bear. It was a slow, agonizing process, not a sudden, violent death. As the sun sets on what was once the mightiest empire, you are left with the echoes of a fallen giant. You are not witnessing a sudden death, but a long, drawn-out fading, a slow surrender to the forces of change. The grandeur has faded, the legions are gone, and the emperors are no more. But life, in its tenacious way, continues. New beginnings, however humble, are being forged in the dust of a fallen empire, laying the groundwork for a new, fragmented, but ultimately resilient, medieval world.